Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Friday Coffee Meetup. Friday Coffee Meetup is the largest active innovation, entrepreneurial, and tech meetup in Los Angeles, California. I am so pleased that we have David Fleck here with us this morning. He is the founder and managing partner of Freeflow, and he is going to be speaking to us about breakthrough scientific technologies that solve global challenges. It's a big issue. Freeflow, they focus 100% on supporting students out of Caltech and JPL, entrepreneurs who take their scientific knowledge to use to solve massive problems facing mankind, and at the same time, possibly generating massive returns. Freeflow invests in scientific technologies backed by computer science, and they focus in two areas of sustainability: planetary issues and human health. David, we are so pleased to have you here with us this morning. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. You want me to just take it from here?
Yes, you can take it from here. Go ahead and share.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just share my screen. So what I like to do is just introduce myself a little bit and what we're doing here at Freeflow, and just a little bit about me personally too. But then what I always enjoy the most is the questions. So please start to get those going, and I'll leave plenty of time for those. So I like to start with this one because this is really what drives us day to day. Is there are existential crises going on in our on our planet that deal with human health and planetary health, climate change, and counter that. And we humbly feel that these are the heroes, right? And they don't have what they need sometimes in order to impact change. And being good old-fashioned capitalists as well, we think that not always, but oftentimes the way to impact change is by actually getting something out into the market. There are spots where government can be impactful, but sometimes the timing for that can be frustrating, or sometimes it's not perhaps the right tool. So what we've really focused on is building a firm that's focused on Caltech and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, which I must say it was gave me goosebumps to see yesterday. In some ways, what humanity can do when they pull together. With perseverance. I mean, we're fortunate to know some of the people that were part of that, and it's just, I don't know, it's extremely humbling to see that, and it just gives me hope for humanity. But going back to what we're doing, so we really do feel like Caltech is the original moonshot factory. It's many Nobel laureates have called Caltech home, including, I believe it was 2 from this most recent class of laureates. It's also home to JPL, obviously, and many people don't know that. I mean, many of you probably do because of where you live, but it's an operating division of Caltech, and Caltech itself is prolific in terms of IP production. That's something that I think a lot of people don't realize is, they generate 2 to 3 times as many patents per capita, so per PI, if you want to think of that, primary investigator or researcher, than MIT or Stanford, which is in some ways, their kind of peer group. But and I think the last point on here is important too. It's a place that is definitely also becoming prolific in terms of the startups that it creates. So both Schrodinger and Glaukos, which are now $7 and $4 billion companies respectively, were founded by researchers at Caltech, and those both went public over the past, call it 5 to 10 years. Schrodinger was just last year. I forget when Glaukos went public, but so those are recent data points. And so me and my partner Kevin, we had the insight that Caltech really was underdeveloped from a from a startup ecosystem perspective. And that actually is not meant to be dismissive or not unappreciative of. I think Caltech itself and the city of Pasadena and Southern California has done an amazing job actually to kind of create this moment, which we think is a pretty special moment for specifically our world, Caltech and JPL, but more broadly, Pasadena as a startup ecosystem and Los Angeles as a startup ecosystem by extension. And so, we really saw that, there was an unmet need here. And, in some ways the need was driven by, at least the way that I describe it, in some ways geography, not entirely, but in some ways geography, where the just being on the east side of Los Angeles just makes it harder for the capital that's oftentimes on the west side or up in the Bay Area, but within LA on the west side to kind of spend a lot of time at Caltech. And we took almost a contrarian approach and said, we're only going to invest at Caltech and JPL, and we're only going to spend time there and spend 100% of our time there. And I think that's why that's one of the strategic moves early on that we decided on that I think has really been a difference maker, because when people ask, hey, why is this ecosystem underdeveloped but quite promising, if you will, like why are you guys having the early successes you are? And I always boil it down to two things, which is number one, the timing I think is quite important. And what I mean by that is really until fairly recently, many of the researchers that would go to Caltech, they having a startup was not really something that they usually would consider. But more recently, I think perhaps over the past 5 or so years, I'm just kind of guessing or estimating based upon the people that I've known there for a while, it started to really change where now a researcher, if they come across something that has interesting translational potential in the research, they want the optionality of starting a company, which makes sense when you consider their peer group and who they went to school with. And many of them have spent time at other places where there's more of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So that's one reason. And the other reason really is our approach, which I began to describe, which is our approach is really, we've decided to dedicate ourselves 100% to this ecosystem because we see enough deal flow to just put it in kind of very perhaps crass terms, but we see plenty of opportunity for a first fund, for a second fund at Caltech and JPL. And so a little bit about myself and my partner. So, and I'll do that chronologically because that might be helpful for people that maybe are thinking about how they manage their careers as well. So I actually started out as an accountant at Price Waterhouse 20 some years ago, and that gave me the opportunity to really get into financial statements and be comfortable with the numbers and cash flows and just what you kind of look at as a business. And then I went to Bain and Company, which is a consulting firm, kind of like McKinsey and others. And there I did a lot of work with actually venture capital funds and private equity funds. Then from there I went to Google, where very early on got to know Minnie Ingersoll, who maybe is in the audience today, who's a dear friend of mine. So shout out to Minnie. That's how I met my wife. That was pretty transformative because it just kind of made me think big about the world and that you can actually, pursue capitalist or, build a business, but also try to do it mindfully. And then I had a string of different startups along the way where I had senior roles. It was a few of them that had nice exits. The last one was Discuss, which we sold for about 90 million. And that one was pretty transformative for me, because that's really where I got to know Fred Wilson, who's a dear friend and mentor to me. And, one of the top, I think, VCs, but also just an amazing human. And from him, I really learned that you can actually be a human and be a thoughtful person and a caring person, and also an investor. Unfortunately, that had not been my experience to date until I kind of worked with and met Fred. So really give him credit for making me see that there was a different way to do this. And we bring those sensitivities to what we do every day. And my partner, Kevin, just to say a couple words on him because it's important, I guess to back up. So, I kind of bring that a lot of the work that I did, have done commercially has dealt with machine learning for probably the past 13 or 14 years. And so I'm comfortable in that space in terms of like how you apply machine learning to new businesses or build new businesses based upon machine learning, which is a lot of what we do actually. Kevin actually brings a different perspective. He obviously has some experience with that, but his experience is really much more on the healthcare side. So, healthcare is a big part of what we do. And it's not something that I've had a lot of experience with in my career until now. But Kevin he started a genomics company that went public. He's the former CEO of Planetary Health, which was sold for close to $1 billion. And so, really those two sets of expertise together, that Venn diagram, if you will, of the two of us has been, one of the critical reasons why we've at least got off to the start we have. And just a little bit about how we met. We actually met on the board of trustees of Family Promise, which is the largest nonprofit here in the U.S. dealing with child homelessness, which to me is, every time I say that or think about that, it just tells me that there's a lot of work we have to do in this world because there are so many children that are homeless. So beyond that, so just a little bit about us, and again, I'll try to move through this fairly quickly so we can get to questions, but we're a seed stage fund. We've done 6 investments to date. We're operators. So that's when you think about maybe what scientific founders need to get started, they really appreciate the fact that we're operators and they can look at the experience we've had. And also obviously when they speak with us, they can just, they just, generally speaking, I think they just kind of know that we've been around the block. And we will make mistakes just as they do. But we have the, battle scars, if you will, where we've actually made the mistakes before and we're trying to counsel them on how to avoid making the same mistakes we've made. So we've raised 10 million. We usually put in like 250 to $1 million in a company, and then we reserve another, call it $1 million, for subsequent rounds. We're generally targeting like 5 to 10% of the cap table of the equity of the preferred. So I think this is actually interesting to hit on. So some LPs, as we onboard more investors, have kind of asked, what's your, you're off to a good start. How's this defensible? As you start to have some of the deals that you have, and they're, some of them are starting to get markups or new investors that are increasing the valuation of our companies. They're like, how do you make sure you keep that competitive position strong? And the way that we think about it is actually it's all about relationships, and we're just part of the community, and we've been able to remain part of the community even in this challenging environment that we're in now. Takes a little bit more effort and can sometimes just feel different, but it's extremely important. I can't stress enough how important it's been for us. But here's just some examples. So, for example, David Baltimore, who's just an amazingly humble, accomplished person. He's one of our initial founders. he's I don't know his age, but he's one of those people that just had amazing success in his life. And when we met with him and he had another idea for a company, we were excited to explore that and are very excited to with the progress that company's making actually. That one is allogeneic stem cell therapy. So basically think of, in some ways think of donor bone marrow as a way to to solve some of the most challenging cancers. And there's other examples on here too. We work closely with Caltech's tech transfer office. They do an amazing job. They really do. They've they have an EIR program that's been I think quite impactful to setting the table, if you will, for where things stand today. So we've really enjoyed getting to know that team and work with that team. And we've met with, now it's actually about half of the professors there. So, it's really a one-to-one. And the interesting thing about the people that we meet is, when we're evaluating whether or not they have, something that might have commercial potential is, we're patient. I don't know how else to put it. And because we know our ecosystem is this ecosystem, we don't get distracted by, what's happening somewhere else geographically. We're just locked in here. And, that's somewhat liberating, because what happens with a lot of the professors is, they may say, hey, we have this idea or that idea. And we spend a fair amount of time with them way before they've started a company, just, getting to know them, getting to know, what their dreams are, what most excites them. That's probably as we look at people that want to be founders, we really need them to be excited about it. I mean, it might sound obvious, but sometimes there are founders who start this voyage, as a startup founder, and they're not really that excited about the core thing. They see it as an opportunity to make money, but not as an opportunity to maybe spend their energy. And we think, and truthfully, we haven't, I don't think, really encountered any of those types at Caltech. But really, what we boil down to is we just want to make sure that they're getting a high return for their energy and their time, because that's a critical determinant of success. Especially when you're investing like we are at the seed round. It's important to understand, is this person in it to win it? Is this all they really want to do? A little bit about, how we think about investments, because again, when you think about, these are scientific founders. So how do we know it's time, it's time to go, it's time to maybe start the company? Because oftentimes, maybe even most of the time, there's no company actually started yet when we decide to invest. And it all comes together at one moment when, we've gotten to know the founder, they've worked in the lab for a while, and maybe we're getting ready to spin something out, and maybe have been working on it for a while, but just still haven't done that official spin out of their lab. What we look for, number one, is, that's the first thing on the top, is the science known? So in other words, is the science proven? And the reason I call that out is because it's a essentially a big risk factor if the science is not yet proven, because sometimes science might be almost there, but that last 1 to 5% takes another year or two, right? Or millions of dollars. And so for us, it's critical, particularly when you consider our check size. We really have to know the science is proven, and that's essentially, in some ways, perhaps the measuring stick we use is there a peer-reviewed journal article that's been written about this, or a preprint? We don't get too hung up on preprint versus published, but we just want to kind of see that there's enough there that to really dig into, and that we're not taking a ton of science risk. Um, and by the way, if there's still science risk, that's fine. We still try to help the founders, because we're actually, one of the key things that we've built out is a way to help founders with non-dilutive funding, which is essentially grants. And we don't do that ourselves from our own balance sheet, but we've become fairly proficient at and built relationships within the ecosystem so that we can try to direct our founders and coordinate ways for them to receive non-dilutive funding to further their science and hopefully still prepare it for an investable moment in the future. Then when you get to the next line, that's product market fit. That really boils down to just what's the market need? How are these scientists attacking that need? How big is that market opportunity? And the last thing is the team identified, and that really gets to the question of, at least from our perspective, who's the business lead and who's the scientific lead out of the gates. So, here's some of the firms, we invest with and that have invested in us. So we, as Christy did say at the outset, we really focus on planetary health and human health. And what we mean by that is, you can see examples here. So for planetary health, energy production and storage, that can include things like batteries, green hydrogen, actually. You see others on here, food and ag. One of our next investments is coming out of JPL, actually. I'll talk about that here in a few minutes, but deals with water, how to make our food supply, and in yields more effective. And then down at the bottom, you see we invest in human health as well. So that runs the gamut from devices to therapeutics and diagnostics, to drug discovery platforms, which oftentimes are computer science based applications. A little bit about each investment, and I'll just hit on these pretty quickly. This is David, as I mentioned before, this is David Baltimore's company. It's allogeneic stem cell therapy. So basically it's treating, various awful types of cancers that probably have impacted many people in this Zoom today, or family members of theirs in catastrophic ways. So this one, including my family. So this is just an honor to be part of this one, but it's also one that they're doing quite well. They're yeah, I don't want to get into too many details, but it's going quite well today. So proud of what the work this team's doing. Tufan, that's Maury Garib, who's the founder of Glaukos, the company I mentioned at the outset. That's now a $4 billion company. He now runs CAST at Caltech, the Center for Autonomous Systems and Technologies. And basically they had this, it's autonomous heavy lift drone is the best way to put this. And they just had this insight that by rethinking the design of drones, they can make them stronger and then build in some autonomy as well. And so this one, again, is it's going well. These guys as well. Entos, this is basically a computer science platform that's doing next gen discovery of new molecules by using quantum chemistry, and basically applying best practices, if you will, on machine learning and AI. It's the type of thing that really, it's funny when I talked to Tom and Fred about this. When we made the investment, they said it was only about a quarter or two before we made the investment that they were even able to really scratch the surface of what they wanted to build here, because in some ways they're so pushing, what you can do with cloud, ML, AI, things like that. Really pushing the technologies on the computer science side. So, this is kind of bleeding edge stuff, and in some ways, we think is perhaps the next Schrodinger, because Schrodinger does some analogous things. Molecular instruments. These guys have been at it for a couple of years now and hadn't taken any outside money. And really, it's just a new type of diagnostic. Niles was his lab actually was the inventors of hybridization chain reaction, HCR, which enables just a different type of high resolution imaging. And interestingly enough, one of the things I love about this one is 100% e-commerce, and has been for a long time. And the reason it's interesting is because it's, at least to me, is because it just eliminates all the errors that can occur in ordering. So this one, for example, when you're doing biologic diagnostic, testing like them, there's oftentimes so many errors in ordering. And so what they've done is they simplified that and said, let's just do it on e-commerce. So that way, if you're choosing, for example, the mouse model, if you're studying in a mouse model, you can then have all the rest of the fields dynamically populate so that you don't have all these ordering errors. So again, amazing technology that they built, but then I just love how they have operationalized that. You want to tell what this is with Circus? Just if you've heard about just the microbiome, so your gut, this is a company that's focused on really better understanding the microbiome and how that impacts drug efficacy. It's probably the best way to put it. At a very personalized, perhaps, personalized medicine, or at a one-to-one level over time, I can envision. And then DNA2, this is a company that's, again, going after cancer, but it's interesting. So they basically discovered, so Judy has been working on this for a long, long time. There's a DNA2 protein within cancer that essentially is how cancer can grow as fast as it does. I'm vastly simplifying this, but what they found is there's a way to stop that protein from growing. And then the last two things I want to say were just, in lieu of what happened yesterday, is we had you have two upcoming investments coming out of JPL. One focused on basically, infrared and thermal imaging. So basically, it's what's the water footprint or the heat footprint, and they're applying that to basically to agriculture. And then another one is mission as a service. So all that stuff you saw yesterday for how, if you looked ahead of time and saw that how Perseverance was being run, as space becomes an investable area, there's a team and technology that's spinning out of JPL that's basically going to allow for many of these other companies that want to get into space and do other interesting things to do that. So with that, I will stop.
Wonderful.
My rambling and enable questions.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, David. Great presentation there. For those of you who have just come in, we do our Q&A, the Q&A panel. So go ahead and put your questions there. We won't be monitoring the chat. Our first questions are around investments and, you guys taking the lead as the seed. So do you have co-investors in your seed round? And if so, what kind of investors are they? Are they funds? Are they angels for that first round?
Yeah, so great question. So to directly answer the question, on our seeds, it's generally other firms. And so some of the firms include 8VC, Embark Ventures, Nexus Venture Partners, but I'll unpack that a little bit more. So we invest at the pre-seed and the seed, and that, to many, if you're not in venture, that might sound like splitting hairs, but I'll explain what that means. So pre-seed is, call it, $500K, to get a company started. And then generally what I consider seed is maybe more 2 million or 3 million or something, just directionally. And so at the 500K level, up to $1 million or so pre-seed, that's something that we can, with our balance sheet and we can comfortably just cut that check and do that ourselves if we so desire. We still actually will oftentimes syndicate that with somebody else just to get more expertise around the table, but we also can do that ourselves as well if the situation arises. On the seed, that's where that $2 to $3 million check, that's something that, at least with our balance sheet today, that's not something we're going to just take the full seed, number one. Number two, it's actually kind of nice sometimes to find a firm that is really jockeying for the A. And if we can get them in as the co-investor with us, in some ways it de-risks our downstream financing risk of who's going to take the A. And so we'll oftentimes collaborate and bring in a lead and come in alongside them on the seed. So there's a lot of inside baseball jargon in there. So hopefully that answered the question, though.
It does. And then for your series, when they go to Series A, do you guys participate, or do you guys have second round? I know you touched on that a little bit when you mentioned Series A. And at that point, for the next round, do the companies have revenue?
Yeah, so we do invest at the A. Some of our companies are doing A's right now, so we do invest at the A. We generally just we protect the pro rata is how I describe it. And so and then do the companies have revenue? Our portfolio really bifurcates along two lines. One would be those who are going after something that might require an FDA approval. So with those, generally speaking, they won't have revenues at the A. Although what I'll say is generally they do have significant non-dilutive funding that has come into the company via, in some instances, partnerships. So one of our companies, one of our early breakout companies, is in the late stages of a major partnership with a biopharma company where there's going to be, I guess it'd be over 10 million is just to use a ballpark coming into the company for co-development of molecules. And there's a bunch of other things that come along with that. And so that's, we love that as a market sign. But then on our other companies, it's interesting. Most of them actually have revenue. So those who are not going after a molecule or need FDA approval, most of our companies, and I actually found them to guess, let me just do a quick, actually all of our companies that don't have an FDA kind of requirement for what they're doing already have revenues, which is interesting because I don't know, we've been surprised by that. And it just kind of shows that these founders are hustling when we have already met them. But we're very much, the way I describe us is we're impatient investors when it comes to testing the market. Like, we want our founders to be out there seeing if they can generate revenue early on, seeing if they can strike a partnership pretty early on, because it really gives you a lot of data about, just about how what track they're on. Are they on the right path?
And from those investments, what's the range of ROI on those?
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
From the investments that you're making, what kind of returns are you seeing?
It's just too.
I think your target was like 5 to 10% on the first slide, but how is that working out?
So, well, in terms of just returns, I mean, it's too early for us to. Sorry, and make sure I'm answering your question, but it's too early to. In venture is like a 10-year game, if you will. So, we're a year and a half into this fund, which is our first fund. So it's, we have. I could give you a number, but it would be so preliminary that it, and maybe that's important for people. Maybe the more important point is for people to understand that, within venture, we look at things that generally from like a 10-year fund perspective. Actually, I was just talking to a potential LP about this issue last night. And with venture, the average time to exit is about 6 years. And so, and most of the time that, the funds are structured where you have 4 years to invest your capital. So our fund will end up being about a $50 million fund. So we'll have 4 years from our first close, which was November 1st of 2019, to deploy, our first 25 investments. And, it'll take 6 or 7 years for those to reach maturity. All that being said, we do think the early indications are promising, and our goal all along has been to be a 5x, 5 times net of fees fund, which puts us in the top decile or top 10% of venture funds. And I think we're making progress toward that goal, but there's still a lot. We're in the very, very beginnings of this.
Great. Thank you for that. And I think
Yeah.
you hit an important point there about the longevity of these types of investments. Can you talk a little bit about your LPs?
Yeah, so our LPs include, well, at the end of the day, actually, for those of you out there who might be contemplating raising a fund, our LPs are, generally speaking, fellow travelers is how I think about it, right? Like people who, and it is generally people, we are starting to get institutions involved, but the early LPs were all people, and I make that distinction. They might have invested via their trust or something, but it's all people that right? That either or you get to know that really believe in what you're building. And for us, it's comprised of, as I mentioned, some great investors, like Fred Wilson and Union Square Ventures, Chris Farmer and Signal Fire, Chris Duvos and Ahoy Capital. And then it's a bunch of other, generally speaking, family offices that, or high net worth individuals who really, at the end of the day, I think believed in us and also believed in maybe what we were going after, right? Like just that whole, how we started out where, hey, there's some really existential issues that humanity's facing, and Caltech and JPL, people know that those places are working on the hardest problems. And so in some ways it's almost trust in the fact that, yes, those are actually huge issues. And yes, we believe those people can solve those issues. And we believe that there could be really massive outcomes that occur if you execute that strategy. So.
Has that been a kind of that viewpoint around social investing and doing kind of the right thing? What has that process been like for you coming in, owning the fund? Has it been difficult to grasp, or are people on board? Do you see a shift in that kind of perspective where we are in the world right now?
Yeah, it's been pretty eye-opening. So and sometimes it's hard to even remember what it was like pre-COVID. So I've been at this personally for 3 or 4 years now. We officially launched the fund. So, essentially it's probably about 4 years ago is when I started just spending dedicated time around Caltech. Like I knew some of the professors and some of the administration, and I just started, I had sold my last company. So I just started spending time there. And so that kind of grew into me saying, you know what, I think I want to actually go after this question that's perplexed me for years, which is, why aren't there more things coming out? There are great things coming out, but why aren't there more things coming out? Which then led to me understanding that essentially the only, most things at Caltech, particularly within the consideration set of those that might have translational potential, they just naturally fall into these two buckets, to be honest. So it was really an early on a simpatico relationship where Caltech was doing the things that were, I guess, important to me as a person, and that I can really get behind anyway. And so, from that perspective, we've been doing this my point with that is like, we've been doing this for a while, but then to bring it back to your original comment, which is, have people really understood or gotten on board with the thesis, it's been really interesting to see what's happened post-COVID, because not that we're post-COVID, maybe in the midst of COVID, but is that a lot more understanding by investors that there are other things to perhaps invest in and generate returns from than the traditional, and there's still many great businesses in these fields, but like SaaS or social or, I think they understood at a more visceral level, if you will, wow, you're right. There's some other things that we need to solve for. So just kind of place the spotlight on that. And so it's really, I think, changed, how a lot of LPs or investors view the opportunity.
David, this is John. I was hoping I could maybe jump in real quickly and ask a question.
Yeah.
When you mentioned Bain, I recall Mitt Romney used to be the CEO. Were you there at the same time as Mitt, or just out of curiosity?
No, well, he was, and this is something that I think he tried to explain too. I mean, I don't know him, but he was the founder of Bain Capital, which was a spin-off of Bain, if you will. It's a private equity fund. So I was at Bain and Company, the consulting firm, and Bain Capital was a bunch of Bain partners who left so I did not overlap with him, but different company as well.
Okay. Thanks for that. But anyways, you mentioned Embark. We actually had Peter, who's one of the founders of Embark, come speak to us, and he talked about their investment profile and deep technology and things like that. So it's interesting hearing you talk about the same thing, looking at patents and disruption in the marketplace and as part of your investment criteria. The question that I have for you, though, is, of all the companies that you've been involved with, all the startups and all that, in what percentage of those cases would you say that you guys felt you needed to bring in professional management to replace a founder, because the founders are scientists or technologists, are not necessarily, I don't mean this to be in a negative way, business people. And so for them to grow the company, to build the company, all that, those individuals may not be, the right individuals to do that. So if you could talk a little bit about that, as far as, maybe some of the value that you guys bring to the table.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We're, and this isn't just a philosophy. This is like almost a religion. We're extremely founder friendly. And the reason for that is, at least from my experience, the energy within an organization dramatically changes when the founders aren't there. It's just a completely different organization. And to your point, there are times where, there just needs to be a different set of skills leading certain facets of the company. But I think companies are generally speaking, and this is generally speaking, and there are always going to be exceptions that come up or potential problems that come up. But generally speaking, companies, from my perspective, are better when the founders are around, and that may not always be the CEO role. And that's the thing. What we do early on. When I first meet with people and they're thinking about starting a company, the CEO role is always there as a potential discussion point. But if it's not the right fit, then we're very candid about that early on. And then we're also candid about the fact that even if they are the CEO initially, that probably won't be the case forever. And just kind of setting the expectation that, hey, once you start a company, you're actually a fiduciary of the company now. You're not a fiduciary of your ego, which is like a hard thing sometimes to understand. But we try to really make that point clear early on so that there's no surprises later. And there will always be surprises because people don't always want to hear that message. But we try to be as open about that as we can. So, to answer your question, John?
We'll go with yes. Do you and your partner provide input to the companies on their intellectual property strategies?
We do. Yeah. I mean, maybe the best way to put it is, I'll retract that. We don't, but we do via our legal counsel. So that's probably an important thing to bring up is, one of the things that we take, or that we've tried to do throughout Freeflow is just bring in true industrial grade partners that are world-class experts at what they do, right? Like we work with, the top, one of the top law firms, and that's because, I mean, in essence, we think that's very good. Although we don't like the bills, I mean, we think it's money well spent to have someone looking over our shoulder to make sure that we're doing the IP correctly, that to make sure that we're executing our investment correctly too. There's, that I view that, I view legal in some ways as an insurance policy. That we hope that it is not needed, but it's money well spent to do that right. Don't tell my law firm that, please. But
I think it's a great insurance, yes.
Yeah. So.
On the structure, do you have a team then of, you obviously have legal, do you have like HR and operations that the investment companies work with, or do you place people into the companies? How does that work?
In terms of hiring for the companies, is that what you're getting at?
Hiring and kind of what the structure is your team centralized, and then your teams work with maybe a central HR person or a central operations team, or are there HR and operations within each of the companies? And do you help place those people?
Yeah, it's definitely the latter. So we're not, in some ways people are like, are you an incubator? I mean, some of these lines really kind of start to bleed together, if you will, but we don't have a lot of central, other than Kevin and myself, who we're kind of the primary care physician, to use the analogy maybe. And we have specialists that we can refer our companies to on an as needed basis. But generally speaking, with the companies, we have a bunch of people that we've worked with and have official relationships with that we generally bring and introduce the companies to. For example, there's a recruiter that we have on our team. So when companies are doing those first hires, there's someone there that is really meant to partner with them to find those people. We found that's a really big point of differentiation for us, is like we can really get in the nitty gritty with them on team building from day one. Other than that, I mean, it's definitely much more of a, we kind of refer them to people as needed. And there's a select group of people that we find are very valuable on IP, on legal, on team building, on go-to-market, on some of those core basic things that we just repeatedly see as issues or things to address at the early stages of a new company, particularly one whose founders are scientists from Caltech or JPL.
Right. Great. I'm sure they appreciate that support. Can you talk a little bit about the imaging company focused on agriculture again? We have somebody on the line who might want to be customers. Oh,
yeah. So, yeah, that company, it's interesting. I mean, what they do is, well, again, and that's out of JPL, which, big props to JPL. Very good to see them highlighted so prominently and the amazing people that are there. This one's interesting. So what they've done is first of all, they developed a sensor at JPL that really, in some ways, the way to describe it is it's much more accurate at a much more detailed level than any other sensor that at least we've seen or know about for thermal and infrared imaging, and it's really interesting. I mean, this is something we just didn't know, but that the thermal and IR data, if you will, of our planet, it does exist. So there is a NASA satellite that can provide that data at about a 2-week interval. But if there's clouds, then it might be every 4 weeks, right? I mean, you might have to do it or 6 weeks, right? I mean, and so cloud impacts the ability to capture the data. There's ways to attack that with machine learning and AI, but then with the NASA data, sometimes you're kind of getting it every 2 to 4 weeks. So when you think about the applications of that type of data, that's really going to give you information on, for example, how healthy are the plants in that area. You can tell a lot by the thermal and IR footprint, how healthy plants are, which you can then infer yield from, for example, which you can also infer, hey, do we need to water these plants now, or when should they be watered next? And so there's really a lot of downstream markets for that data, like farmers, for example, that might want to take an action on watering. When you think about the large agricultural companies like Archer Daniels Midland or Bunge, or even the companies like Dannon and Nestle. There's a lot of companies kind of have needs for planning, purchasing for commodities like soy and corn and things like that. So you can get a lot of data on on the projected yields. And even hedge funds and other companies that are just much more interested in commodities from a financial instrument perspective. That's not a market we think about too much, but they've expressed interest in this company's data. So it's pretty different when you think about it. There's a cost. With this company, it's going to be about $4 million to get the first satellite up and get the data starting to come in, and they've done more limited tests and have customers that are already working with them on the more limited tests. So it's a piece of data that has been glaring in it's omission in terms of I think in some ways what we're trying to do and what we're trying to understand about our planet. So we're excited about that one. Thanks for the question.
Thank you for sharing more information about that. We're going to wrap up here in just a second and take it over to open networking. We will be having open networking today, but as we transition to that, can you leave us with what is keeping you inspired? It has been a difficult year for everyone. How are you staying inspired in your own life and leadership?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Really, I mean, well, there's not really an option to, in some ways, when you're creating something new, what I love sometimes is explain to our founders or reinforcing like, hey, I'm a founder too. And it's pretty different, right? When some firms, big firms that have been around for a while, you may be talking to a partner that is a partner and is a good VC, don't get me wrong. But there's something about being a founder as well that you're like, hey, you know how you're stressed about your company? Like we're building this too. And just that empathy, if you will. So, what I'm getting at is there hasn't really, I have to be kind of all in on this because there's no other option, right? So that's given me a lot of focus during this time. I know in the pre-talk to this, I kind of jokingly talked about how, I'm an extrovert and it's been interesting to have to be an introvert, if you will, for the past year. And some of the benefits of that are just like the intense focus you can have, especially when you're trying to create something. So, in some ways, I'm not sure if we would have made the progress we have made today if there hadn't been this forced focusing time. But then you have on the flip side as well, you have the fact that, our founders are then working on things that in some ways were directly related to COVID. And, where they're like, it's not their business. They're not trying to take advantage of this environment. But, you know, if you know, the company that does machine learning for new molecules, I mean, some of the COVID vaccine work was done on their platform. So it's like, it's just cool to see companies that you're working with in their own small way, you know, but because of the fact that companies that we've invested in are working on these problems, you kind of feel like you're working on these problems too, even though I'm not a scientist. And yeah, that's given me kind of been inspiring as well in some of the, you know, those lower moments, if you will. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you for sharing that little bit of inspiration. We are going to transition over to open networking here in just a second. For those of you that are attending on LinkedIn Live, thank you for being with us today. Our next meetup is scheduled for the 5th of March, where we're going to be hearing from David Wang on back office blunders. So be sure and join us then. For those of you who are on the Zoom call, give us a moment. We will transition you over and you can use your videos and cameras and get to know David a little bit more and get to know one another. Thank you.
Thank you.